These are notes 10.2, the West is transformed. So as we go through this, some of this would be um, kind of a continuation of something you would have learned in early American history as we talked about the West opening in the 30s and 40s. But after the Civil War, we began to see a great expansion of the West. There were some reasons for that. Here's our key terms: vigilantes, transcontinental railroad, land grants, open range system, the Homestead Act, exodusters, and Las Goras Blancas. A couple things that we can identify here, that mining had a big part of the expansion of the West, also the railroad. And as we look at some of these trails that originally started, you can see that a lot of these were earlier 1800s than we're talking about. But these trails led a lot of people to the West, and eventually will be routes that railroads and other places will um, follow the same basic paths. Um, Especially like you can kind of see some of the comparisons of the Oregon Trail to the Transcontinental Railroad. Mining affected expansion and brought people west. Without mining, it wouldn't have exploded in such a way. We have this idea of a boom town. Here's a great example of a boom town in the West, where not only the railroad would lay track beside it, but also they would be close enough to where they could gold and silver would be able to be mined. At times, sometimes these towns would like pop up in maybe a few months, um, put together very quickly. Sometimes lumber was just kind of thrown together, um, and they would boom. And then when all the gold and silver is gone, obviously it would bust. Some of the places that started out as a boom town, like Lead, South Dakota, Custer, both of those were kind of boom towns, and they still some of them still have managed to stay a town or a city, but a lot of them did change and basically became what's called a ghost town. And you can still find those as you travel to different areas of either South Dakota or Wyoming and Montana. Um, Both of those have examples of those boom towns. If we look at some of these gold mining places, also silver mining, um, has the date of when they found ore. Let's just look at South Dakota. We have Deadwood, 1874, Custer, 1874 also. If we look at some places that you can still identify today, Denver, even though it was originally a gold mining town in 1858, it still actually ended up being, a town that stayed um, and continued after um, the rushes. Boise City and Coeur d'Alene both are examples of that. Helena, Montana, it's not on this particular map, but it's one of those examples of mining towns that eventually turned into a bigger town. In the very beginning, when they began to mine, it was what we would call by hand. So they would use gold pans. They would put a lot of time, if they were not using streams, they were digging into the earth to find the gold. There's a Broken Boot gold mine up in Lead, shows you some of the beginnings of gold um, in that particular mine, and a lot of that was cut out. But they did use dynamite for some of that. But in the very beginning, you'll actually find them using picks and things like that to dig into the earth. Eventually, large companies will have the support of the federal government, and they will begin to use water, high pressure water, even in the late 1800s, to separate the silt from the mineral. And it's kind of the same idea of fracking that we use today in North Dakota to gain oil. A lot of water is pushed into these areas, and as the water comes out, it separates the dirt from the mineral. One of the problems with that is the usage of water, because water, especially in the western states, is one of those things that's debated and needed by all. So you have to keep that in mind. This causes a problem between farmers and ranchers and miners. Illinois Railroad spurred growth, meaning a lot of towns growing up along the um, the edge of the railroad lines. just like we have the Pony Express or Oregon Trails. It's the same basic idea. Um, right here is the Union Pacific and the orange line. The Central Pacific was the green line. Um, right here in Promontory, Utah, called Promontory Point, is where they met, and that's where we have this example here of the meeting, the golden spike of the two railroads. Congress would make land grants to railroads who would build them. If they would build a railroad, they would give them land on each side of the track, and so railroads began to grow up because all they had to do was pay for the labor and the cost of building the road, not the cost of the land. The railroads did bring regional areas of the United States together. So New York to San Francisco was only a couple days' journey, and that really changes the face of America. And as we look at American history, that makes an even bigger impact. As far as population, you had to have so many people before you could actually apply as a state. So we can see a lot of these Western states coming into the Union at this point. Nevada in 1864, at the end of the Civil War, Nebraska in 1867, Colorado 1876. And then you can definitely see in the late 1800s we had a large amount happening in the area where we lived, and some of that was ranching and some of that was mining. It kind of depended. In relation to ranching, we have the cattle industry. The cattle industry was a big part of the West. It's kind of what you think of when you think of a Western movie or Western shows. Um, the railroads provided an opportunity for the sale of cattle, and you could send cattle to big stockyards in places like Kansas City and Omaha. The idea was actually from kind of a more Mexican tradition where they would have the cowboy that would um, round up the cattle at the end of the year. The idea of open range where they would just, be on the great vast grassland and, you know, they didn't really have fences or areas that they hayed like we have in ranching today. It was just kind of the open range where the cows would live the entire year, and then at the end of the year, kind of towards the end of the summer, they would do the roundup, and then they would do the cattle drive, which would bring the cattle to the railroad connections. Those were called cow towns. An example of that right here is Dodge City, Kansas. And that took most of the cattle directly to Kansas City, where there was meat processing plants. Um, this was Texas Longhorn, Herefords, a lot of a variety of cows, but we find that they all basically followed the same idea of the roundup and the cattle drive. Today, some of the culture that surrounds that, we have like, places even in the hills that, are cowboy uh, roundups or things like that that kind of play upon that tradition of that. The idea of rodeo starts around this time, based on the life of the cowboy and how he lived his life and competition between them. Not only that, oops, too far. We have the open range system. It ended with the creation of barbed wire. Barbed wire was cheap, it's easy to put up. You could put up a few strands of barbed wire and keep quite a bit of cows in. You could put in miles of barbed wire compared to wooden fence or some type of what we would call like a woven fence, which is a lot more expensive even today. We still have open range. Here's an example of that. If you go out to eastern Montana or eastern Wyoming, just about an hour or two from here, you'll actually find places where they have what's called auto gates, where you pass over the gate where the cows can't get through because it's rods, but a car can, and then it's a basically open range. So you have to watch for cows on those roads. The decrease in the price of beef made a big impact, and that kind of stopped a lot of the open range um, idea. The price of beef was decreased because the supply of beef went up. Also, between the 1880s and 1890s, we had a series of harsh winters, and a lot of cattle died because we had a really harsh winter that killed some of them off, and then we had a drought throughout the plains in the late 1890s. If you look at some of these examples here, you can see where a lot of the grazing land is. The unusable land, we can see some of it in Wyoming and South Dakota, areas of Colorado, but there's still a lot of grazing land there. Also, railroads are running right through this. Cropland becomes more important, especially in eastern South Dakota, which is still today, still that way. If we look at not only ranching but farmers, free or cheap land helped the expansion of the settlement of the West. In the very beginning, it was called the Preemptive Act. It basically sold lands for a couple cents an acre. Um, they would sell the land, and people could come and settle it. Eventually, the Homestead Act will be passed, and when that is passed, they will offer free land instead of just cheap land to settlers. And most of you know that from your vocabulary words, but you had to live on the land and work it, cultivate it for 5 years. You could get 160 acres if you did that. A lot of it was like you had to like drill a well, build a road, things like that. You basically had to live on the land. Of course, during this time, a lot of this land was in treaties given to Native American tribes, but it becomes a whole lot less the Native Americans' land and begins to be the government's way of settling the West. On the prairies, a lot of South Dakota prairie, especially, we have the idea of sod homes. If you think about the movie Little House on the Prairie, um, that whole idea of a sod house for Laura Ingalls Wilder, that's a great example of what it was like to live on the prairies. There wasn't lumber out there. There wasn't wood to heat with, so they used buffalo chips, which is basically buffalo manure that's dried. Barbed wire, steel plows, the grain drill, windmills, all help the plains become more farmable. Irrigation, things like that. But if you look at this right here is a great example of a grain drill, and basically still using horses. These parts here would drill into the ground, and the seeds would drop down in there. Cut hours upon hours out of farming techniques. Also, the steel plow. The uses of steel, they were able to break harder ground that they previously weren't able to break. There's an example of an advertisement for barbed wire there in the middle, and then a sod home over there. Steel plow, the spade took 96 hours. Ox and a wooden plow, 24 hours. Steel plow, 8 hours. So you can see how crops are going to excessively increase. Also, the McCormick Reaper, which would harvest, you can see that that dropped from 24 hours to 1.6 hours. And then we have the idea of barbed wire. It keeps them off the railroad tracks, keeps them out of other people's land, and it's extremely cheap. Also, during this time, we have minorities that encounter difficulties. So Chinese immigrants faced a lot of discrimination. Some towns in California banned the employment of anyone of Chinese descent, no matter who they were. The one place that would employ them was the Central Pacific Railroad, coming from the western area, which from California towards Utah. But railroad was extremely hard labor, and many people died just in either dynamite blasts that went wrong or hard labor accidents in building the railroad. Not only do we have the Chinese, but we also had Mexican Americans. After the Mexican American War, a lot of Mexican Americans could not keep their land, unfortunately. They didn't have property records. If they did have property records, the new government and settlers in that, especially in places like New Mexico, Arizona, and Western Texas, they used corruption and other means that would prevent the Mexican Americans from keeping their land. In response to that, we have the Las Gorras Blancas. They were like a group, kind of like a union, where they sabotaged big ranches, their fences, and they burnt down buildings. They actually had support of the Knights of Labor at one point, but they were kind of like a vigilante Robin Hood type of people.